Okay, here's the first video lecture for my high school students on social psychology. With this PowerPoint, you're going to have to do some writing. You're going to need to take some notes. Depending on which school is looking at this, I gave different instructions for whether or not you would have to submit notes. But everybody needs to take notes. You all need to take notes on this, and I'll kind of guide you through that process. We missed some classes this week, and I know I missed today, Friday. I missed with a lot of my high schools because I had some issues around my home. So go ahead and take care of some of that here. So we'll start with the idea of a group. We're talking about social psychology, and when you think of a group, you might think of different things, or different ideas or notions may come to mind. A group, by definition, consists of more than two people who exist in some setting or some fashion, pursuing some sort of common goal. So there's sort of your working definition. That's not a great definition of a group, but that'll kind of get us started. And so make sure you have that in your notes. And we'll talk more about groups, obviously, as we go. Now, Norman Triplett was a social psychologist. Back in the late 1800s, he was one of the first social scientists that we know of to actually start studying groups and the effects of groups. He studied bicycle racers and discovered that competition could influence the result of racing times. He figured out that bicycle racers had better times when they were competing against other racers, as opposed to just racing alone, just like playing beat the clock, so to say. So what he discovered, and write this in your notes right here somewhere, write this. Triplett discovered that competition enhances performance. In other words, competition increased performance. It made their times quicker. Now, some characteristics of groups. Just generally speaking, here are some things that we understand to be true, and you'll want to write this down as well. Aggression increases in group settings as opposed to just people acting alone as individuals. When people are in groups, they become more aggressive, whether it's in terms of sports, it can be at work, even at school. Also, de-individuation occurs. De-individuation occurs in group settings. People are more likely to have less inhibition about doing things in group settings. They would do things in groups that they wouldn't do otherwise. An example would be sort of like the mob mentality, like the image that you see here. I used to work with a warden at one of the prisons right where I used to be employed, and he was a state trooper, and he would talk about patrolling the West Virginia Mountaineer football games. He was one of the state troopers on the field after big wins, when the students would come down and they would throw stuff on the field, try to carry the goalposts out. And he would say to me, it was amazing what individual students would do in group settings, things they would never do otherwise alone, or a one-on-one setting on the street with somebody else. They would throw bottles at police officers. They would assault people, doing all kinds of things in this group setting that they wouldn't do otherwise. Diffusion of responsibility. This is another characteristic of groups that I want to talk to you about. It's kind of close to de-individuation, but a little bit different. Diffusion of responsibility. If in a group I see many other people around me, then I'm going to feel less responsible or accountable to help somebody out. This is also known as the bystander effect. So what that really means when you're writing your notes down here, diffusion of responsibility is feeling less responsible or less accountable to help someone out because there are other people around. Example. I'll give you an example of the bystander effect here, or of the diffusion of responsibility effect. True story, there was an apartment complex in New York City, 1980s. There was a woman who was brutally attacked. She was raped and eventually murdered. And this happened over the course of about 25-30 minutes. Now, this was in a very densely populated part of the inner city. There were many, many, many witnesses. A lot of people were watching this happen, and nobody helped. Nobody called the police. Nobody lifted a hand or a finger. Now, probably some of that was fear. A lot of people probably were afraid to get involved, but anyone could have picked up a telephone and called the police. Now, this woman was eventually murdered, and when the police came around to this area, to this apartment complex, they were asking people, "Did you see anything?" People were like, "Yeah, I saw it. I saw it all." Well, police officer asked, "Why didn't you call? Why didn't you pick up a phone and call us?" Well, response, "I thought somebody else would. There were hundreds of people watching this. Surely somebody else picked up the phone to call you," when in fact nobody picked up the phone. Everybody had the same mentality. "Well, I don't feel responsible. Why should I call the police? There's 100, 200, 300 people watching this. Somebody else will do it. Somebody else will intervene." That's diffusion of responsibility. Research will show us that if you're injured, you're better off to be injured in a low populated rural area, like on a country road where there are only 5 or 6 people who could possibly help you. Because if there are fewer people around, those people are going to feel more responsible and accountable for helping you. If you get injured in a big city where hundreds of people are around, you're less likely to get help. And that seems counterintuitive, but it's true, because everybody thinks, well, there's 100 people here, somebody will help, I'll just go on about my day. Work task performance. This is another characteristic of groups that I wanted to talk about in class. How people do tasks alone and how people do tasks in groups may be very different. This gets to something that we call social loafing. Now, write that down in your notes somewhere. Social loafing, L-O-A-F-I-N-G, loafing. To loaf means you're being lazy, right? Well, common sense is probably figuring this out, is going to dictate that people tend to work harder by themselves as opposed to when they are in group settings. Because if you're working by yourself, it's all on you. You have to get it done. You are responsible and accountable. If I assign a group project and I assign 5, 6 people to every group, invariably what's going to happen is one person's going to do 99% of the work and the others are going to coast. They're going to get lazy. Social loafing. We tend to exert less effort and less energy on a project if there are others working on it with us. So our work task performance diminishes when we are in a group setting as opposed to when we are working alone. Also, our identities and self-concepts come from our group affiliations as well. We identify, for example, some people identify as being Democratic or being a Republican, being a Muslim, being a Christian, being whatever. We could go on and on and on. And a lot of this kind of teacher or student, a lot of this, our identities and self-concepts come from the groups that we identify with or that we attach ourselves to. Groups typically have common goals. Write that down. Or they want to accomplish common things. You guys, when you're meeting, whether it's in the auditorium at George Washington High School or in our classroom at South Charleston High School, in our classroom at Winfield High School, Herbert Hoover High School, Riverside High School, St. Albans High School, wherever I happen to be teaching, this is a group. This is an example of a group. You may not know everybody in the group. You may be acquainted with some, and you may know a few people really well, or a lot of people really well in your group, in your classroom. But you do have a common goal. Your common goal is to hopefully pass the course, and hopefully to get something meaningful out of the course. And probably part of this goal is also to acquire a college credit. So, common goals. And also, groups typically have some sort of structure. Patterns start to develop in groups, whether it's at work, at school, or at church. There is a structure to it. At school, for example, there is a structure. Everybody in your high school, this is considered to be a group. Okay, there is a structure. You have classes that you have to attend. Bell rings at certain times. You have scheduled activities. So there's a structure. There's a structure to this. And we'll go ahead and call that the end of the first part here. Thanks.